Indigenous peoples, conservation practices, and knowledge systems, perspectives from different communities. And I had a comment that I'll get to you about moderators, which I'm one. My name is Craig Zarnek from the Great Lakes LCC. And the comment was, it seems like as we get to the last day of the workshop and conference, we start to find the moderators more and more tedious. So with that in mind, and I see heads dying already, I think that's directed at me personally. We're going to move quickly. We have about an hour, and we have a luxury compared to other sessions. A lot of the sessions had multiple speakers. We have 2 speakers. So we have the luxury of having an opportunity to really listen to what these 2 folks have to say. And then we're going to have a good amount of time at the end for discussion. And when I say discussion, I don't so much mean let's draw back the individual slides and try to clarify things. I'm really talking about and discussing some of the things that we're about to learn. So we have 2 speakers that are here with us. First, we're going to have Ulalia Woodside. By the way, it took me 5 or 6 tries when I said, let me hear you say my last name, Zarnek, just like that. But Ulalia is the Regional Lands Asset Manager for the Pacific Islands Climate Change Cooperative. She's going to start. And then we also have Kyle White, who's an assistant professor at Michigan State University. And Kyle hailing from the Great Lakes. And of course, a little bit of affiliation to the LCC that I'm part of. Kyle's working on a project that's, well, I'll let you describe your project when it's your turn, but it's an important effort, not only for the Great Lakes, but we're already starting to see that there's a ripple effect across the country as Kyle and his co-PIs are starting to take on some pretty important questions, I think, for all of us. So between our 2 speakers, we have a great opportunity to learn, and that's what I'm hoping that we'll do. We also have a facilitator in the back who will help us with some of the discussion later on. If you'd like to introduce yourself.
First, Bracken is I'm part of the environmental team, and I'm not a voice of school.
We will also have a note taker. So when we're speaking, let's speak loudly so that you can capture what's going on. And I think with that, we'll get started.
Aloha mai kākou. I'm pleased to be here today and to share with you what the Pacific Island Climate Change Cooperative, Pacific Islands Landscape Conservation Cooperative, which you might hear me refer to as PIXI, has learned of Indigenous peoples' conservation practices and knowledge systems. And since we're always looking for ways to be successful in what we do, we'll share with you a biocultural approach, ethno-ecological landscapes, any of those buzzwords that we may have heard over the past years as a way to facilitate implementation. Our traditions, histories, and values and worldview in the Pacific Islands are passed from one generation to the next through an oral, face-to-face transfer. And that is our first lesson, perhaps, in understanding a people's way of sharing knowledge, and also in that sharing of knowledge is gaining trust. And so for Pacific Island peoples, for those with oral tradition, it is face-to-face. It is my ability to look out there, to see your eyes, and to see you looking back at me, and to see whether or not I think you might be understanding what I'm saying, whether or not you're looking at me and saying she's off her rocker, or maybe she's believable or not. And that's an important part of building trust in communities, and especially in Indigenous communities. I will start and share with you our words as we shape our landscape, shape your understanding of our landscape, because in those words we find the language of the people, recognize that language is developed, in our case, by the 90% endemism that we have in our islands, and that really shapes our culture. And with those words, we begin. No keuli luna lavai kalani Hawaii nona Hawaii No ke kaiuli laloi kamoana Hawaii nona Hawaii No kalapo uli kauna Hawaii nona Hawaii ku inai lunae, ku inai lalo, ku inai ko kako mauloko. I Hawaii mona Hawaii ka aina e amo. This is Hawaii. This is Hawaiki, Hawaii, Savaii. This is who we are. This is life indeed. This is our landscape, Pacific Islands Climate Change Cooperative. And we look at this place and we wonder, these skilled navigators found these islands in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, miles away from other land masses. And we wonder, upon their arrival, did they really see themselves as those Pacific Islanders? Did they see themselves as those Hawaiians? It was those lands that shaped who they were, shaped their language, shaped their culture, and they create this familial relationship, as you see in those words shared in that chant. We tie back to the ocean, we tie to all the celestial beings, we tie to the soil that gives us food, and we create this relationship. And though we may seem different in culture, we may retain a commonality across the Pacific Islands in our language, in our practices, in our customs, in our values, and actually find that Oceania and the Pacific connects us more than it separates us. And we see this as a connecting element in our work, in what we do, and as people. We come to these islands and we find a landscape in the middle of the vast Pacific. Knowledge of the natural cycles was imperative to survival. While it looks idyllic there, we also recognize that without decent management, decent understanding, you can perish without recognizing from the heavens and to the horizon. Traditional island cultures also knew their science of their areas. They had lumpers and segregators and splitters just like we do today. We have specialists that understand specific ocean species, and we have broad thinkers that their kuleana, their responsibility is the broad expanse of everything in the skies, from the stars, the sun, the moon, the atmospheric relationships. And that society is set up with those traditional lumpers or groupers and splitters and the traditional tensions that we face today in understanding and recognizing their world and creating that balance of management. Those specialists understood what it meant in order to manage the landscape, to bring productivity, and together this establishes a guidance for future generations. We see there a term, he ali'i ka'aina, he kaua, he kanaka, and this really is one of the foundations of the guidance. The land is the chief. It's the one that sets the regulations and the laws. I'll say that again. The land is the chief. The land is the one that sets the laws, sets the regulations and the guidance. It is man, he kaua, he kanaka. It is man is the one that is in the service role. Man is the one that follows the direction of the chief, and the chief is the land. In cosmogonic genealogies, it's always the land that's born first, the coral polyp that gives the foundation of our islands. The bird people, the plant people, the fish people are all born first. They're the elder. And the humans, people, are always born second. Probably have heard this before. You've heard this in your indigenous communities that you work with. Why is this relevant to me and the science that I do? And I think that's going to be a common theme, another lesson that we learn and come through is that it actually does need to be relevant. It's incredibly relevant to the communities that we work in, and therefore, drawing from our presentation we just had earlier, it actually is going to be relevant to your science. It's going to be relevant to your decision making that you do, and it's going to be relevant in the relationship of the community, and acknowledging that that is the relationship of the people and that place will help us be more relevant in our communities. Through that relationship and understanding of the chief as being the land and setting up guidelines and resource management in order to establish that, we see productivity, prosperity, abundance. We see that for generations, people are sustained. There are times of drought, famine, flood, times of bad decisions. and there are corrective action that's taken. New laws are set up, new kapu or restrictions to help guide us into appropriate behavior. So that's nothing new. That's similar. We have that today. Sometimes we frequently hear in the tenor of speech regarding Indigenous people's perspectives and their relationship to the land. We hear this tenor and the words seem to focus on use and taking. But it would be detrimental to our ability to effectively address our natural resources in our communities if we continue to stay within that limiting view. We deprive ourselves of generations of wisdom, of the advocates that share the love of these lands, and we deprive ourselves of being truly successful at adaptation if we take just that limiting view on use and taking. There are extremely powerful drivers to Indigenous engagement: cultural identity, spiritual foundation, national heritage, intergenerational equity, the ability to bequest to future generations better than you have today, social cohesion and security, employment and expertise. These are all directly tied to specific places. Now, I use employment there, and you might be thinking, my job, put quotes around that. We're talking about all the types of employment. You know, you see me and you saw that title that's in the book, Regional Asset Manager, and think that's my employment. As an Indigenous person, I have other employment as well. I'm employment as a kumuhula, as a teacher of hula. That employment requires me to understand the moon cycles, understand the growth of the paperbark mulberry so I know when to harvest it, so that I know how to grow it. So the employment, when we see it here in relation to Indigenous peoples, is beyond the regional asset manager. It really is employment and that expertise of the world around, and that's a truly valuable resource and something that we need to remember and think beyond the use and the taking. It is a worldview that's shaped by generations of birth, life, death, work, play, worship, together within the environment, not apart, but together with that environment. And we'll look and we'll see people-looking figures placed throughout this graphic of the environment. Native peoples don't see themselves apart from their world. They don't see themselves as observers, as technical, clinical technicians that sit on the outside to fix something. They recognize their role in the earthly system, in the process of living and dying, of feeding and being fed, of caring and being cared for. These genealogies tie them through generations, from the birth of the coral polyp, gives birth to people, gives birth to land. Holistically, from where a person is born to that land area and that understanding, to the district in which they live, to the island in which they're a part of, to the archipelago, to the broader Pacific, to the world around them. They have understood and divided and split up their world and acknowledged it. And with that understanding of where they fit within it, they have that intimate observation and monitoring. There's certain societal values that are established, prevailing principles, and this diagram shares with us a lokahi, or a symbol of balance and harmony. We see those Hawaiian words there, akua, the one at the apex of the triangle, meaning deity or God. At the foundation of that triangle, you see kanaka for man, aina for land. And we recognize that at the apex, at the pinnacle, in order to have harmony, really is God. And so you got to ask, well, what is God? Who is God? And in the traditional life system, in these lands, in these islands, it's every life-giving element, every life-giving process. That process of the clouds being borne up against the ridges which bring water to the land. Water itself is God. Those are all deities and godly beings and are held in that paramount position, those processes that were required for life, water, air, all types of soil, plants, fish, pigs. We have issues with pigs, the sun, the moon, stars, waves in the ocean. All of these are considered gods. They're given godly names. They're given godly functions. In all of our communities, we're familiar with this story, so I'll go quickly through agents of change. So with this familial relationship, with this spiritual relationship, why do we find a condition that is less than optimal? New spiritual foundations take hold, we no longer see ourselves in this familial relationship. We start to separate ourselves from our world around us. New diseases, depopulation, a rural subsistence lifestyle is no longer possible when you don't have your extended family, when you've had 80% depopulation. You're moving into central locations, into urban centers, and new economy takes hold as Native peoples move away from their lands or are moved from their lands. Those large landscapes are made available for other large landscape altering activities. Agriculture is a big one for us in Hawaii. With that new land ownership, with those new lands, access and control is reduced, is taken away. And we see with that loss, that separation, traditional ecological knowledge is lost. There's limited individuals now that retain that practice. There's substitution that goes on as we have more introduced species, more invasive. Introduced species are used, we start to forget some of the connections that we had to some of our native species. Systems thinking and how it's all connected, from the water cycle to the soil and the plants that we knew so intimately in that diagram are lost, and all of a sudden to be who we are becomes something that's ancient. And we're fortunate, as many indigenous communities are, in the 60s and the 70s, there was a renaissance, a resurgence of practice, a resurgence of language. And in Hawaii, such was the case as well. We see ourselves now in the current society as having almost a renaissance of consciousness, of understanding of who we are. There's a new generation of masters learning from elders, finding knowledge in digital media that now makes thousands of pages of information that was collected in the 1800s available for us quickly and easily online. Those language schools that come out of the 70s, those now help us read those traditional works that we have. We once again understand this integrated system, and we recognize that our identity is dynamic, and that's an important lesson. It's dynamic. It's going to change. We're changing. So we look at just a couple of examples of where we see this as successful and some of those lessons. Papahanao Mokuakea, the Marine National Monument, is also now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, the first mixed site in the U.S. One of the lessons that we learn here, if any of you are familiar with this area, you've got overlapping jurisdictions. NOAA, fish, and all the parts of NOAA, Fish and Wildlife Service, and many parts of Fish and Wildlife Service. You've got state actors here. You've got Native people actors. You have quasi-government agencies set up to advocate for Hawaiian people. And finding a way forward can be challenging, but what we find is you need to acknowledge that history, acknowledge that past, acknowledge all of those players, and it really is about leadership and empowerment. And it was about an advisory council, the mixed body of that advisory council, identifying and recognizing leaders and their expertise and bringing that forward and helping them remain relevant to that community and to that place, acknowledging what was necessary, bringing people back in order to do those practices in that area. We take a look at large landowners and some of the communities that they need to work with, and recognize that when we look at cultural resources, sometimes we get a little bit stovepiped and we see them as those mounds of stone in Hawaii. And it's more than those piles of rock, even though sometimes for our communities, like these elder gentlemen in the lower left hand of your picture there, that really saw those piles of stone and found it as an affront to their cultural identity that they are sitting there in rubble. And taking long years of collaborative work, bringing new generation of leaders, new generation of students to help understand where are those piles of stones, what is the landscape with which it sits, and recognizing that this is beyond just those sites that are there, this postage stamp of cultural history, but they sit within a geographical rich cultural landscape, a biologically rich cultural landscape as well. And changing their mind that it isn't about just restacking those stones, but it is about understanding and reconnecting in a relationship there. And it is through that education, through that time, and through that communication that really built upon that relationship, creating a new generation of masters in this process, in this professional internship, and also bringing along those that feel they have a responsibility to place in that understanding. We have an exciting collaboration between the National Park Service, University of Hawaii, and PIXI in developing a framework to address climate change impacts on cultural resources, and specifically looking at developing that framework. What do we need in order to work within those communities, and the early lessons that we've learned along the way, recognizing that you have to acknowledge that past. You have to acknowledge the history that's there. You have to acknowledge that it's a national park now, that there are other jurisdictions there, and there's a history with the community that may not always be positive. It might not seem relevant to you right now, but it's incredibly relevant to the people that are there. It's incredibly relevant to that science, and recognizing that they are still current, they are still dynamic, and they all still find a place in those communities. Building on that work that's been done in the Pacific Islands, in Hawaii, with a steering committee that is diverse and made up of federal, state, NGO, Indigenous peoples, organizations. PIXI has developed a mission statement as part of our charter that really looks at combining these native island species and ecosystems, recognizing key cultural resources, and looking at ways in which we can have our membership in coordinated action with both institutional and community stakeholders. I don't know all of your LCC's charters. Maybe this is similar. Maybe this is wildly different. But this charter really also shares with us some core assumptions, and I'm only going to share two of the core assumptions that we have, which I think, are really important when we check back and we look at everything that we're doing. We need to make sure that when we are incorporating those climate change models and effects on ecosystems, we need to understand if there's a negative impact on Pacific Island cultures and the critical cultural resources that are there. And recognizing that these cultural resources are more than those piles of stones and the man-made and that built, but recognizing that it's an entire landscape. It is all the geographical, it is all the biological resources that are there as well. Another core assumption that we have is to recognize that successful conservation is only going to be successful if we bring together and build upon the collective understanding, which also means the understanding and the participation of our Pacific Island communities, engaging our Indigenous communities so that we can enhance as well as draw upon that cultural identity, the knowledge and practice equally with what we see as science today. So we have a working definition of our cultural resources. It seems broad. We've tossed it around time and time again, just in that National Park Service work that they're doing. This definition, actually, after we get beyond each of the words, resonates tremendously well with our communities. Any physical, biological, and human elements that strengthen a people's evolving relationship with a defined place and maintain their unique set of customs, beliefs, language, traditional knowledge, objects, and built environment. So this definition really takes in everything that we saw in that universe that was graphically represented. Everything that has a name, everything that has an Indigenous name has meaning. It is of value. We named it. We understood its life process. We understood its role in relation to ours. And therefore, we need to remember that this is all important and relevant. And we also need to remember that we are dynamic, as every culture is dynamic, and things are going to change and evolve. But in years ahead, we want to be able to recognize a defined culture. We will recognize through language, culture, customs, and practices a defined culture. So some very tiny words and some takeaways. This is really about a biocultural landscape, an ethno-ecological landscape. Stovepiping of natural resources and cultural resources isn't going to help us. It is integrated, it's complex, we just kind of got to get over that and start working together. You need to acknowledge roles, meaningful engagement early and consistently, respect for and respect from those traditional knowledge keepers. We always talk about going in there and maybe they can learn something from us. Maybe if we take enough time, we'll educate them. The Hawaiian word for teach and learn is the same, a'o aku a'o mai. It's the same word. And so we also have to recognize we're not just there to teach, we're also there to learn and regain respect as well as to earn respect. We need to respect those generational relationships. Those folks are going to be there generation after generation, long after we've gone. Those traditional communities have been there. We come in and do our science and go, and that's what they see. Sets up a very tenuous relationship with them. We need to remain relevant to them, understand, build that research together with them. Give our research back. Give our hands back. Turn our hands to the soil. Work with them. Learn with them. Stationarity is dead, not just for climate, but also for Indigenous cultures. They're living in dynamic. And each ecosystem is unique. And just so, the corresponding Indigenous community is unique. So we're not going to have this one omnibus definition or way forward. With that, we hope to change that spiral going back up. And we'll see that as there's interest, there'll be ecosystem production. There'll be a transfer of ecological knowledge. And there'll be revitalization, not just for First Nations people, but for all of us in that increased use not just being tangible, but intangible as well. So I'd like to say mahalo, thank you, to all of our steering committee members listed here, federal, state, local NGOs, national NGOs, private landowners, Indigenous peoples. I'd like to also thank our Pixie staff that's here today, Deanna Spooner, Jeff Burgett, Stanton, Lynette, as well as our CSC director, Loyal, for their trust and faith in me to carry our message forward today. They are actually the real experts in this. Mahalo, thank you.
What we're going to do is we're going to take one or two questions right now.
Yep, sure.
Thoughts, questions?
If it's highly technical stuff, we've got Jeff here. Anything new? Heard it all before?
This is a bit half thought out. I just want to hear more stuff. So, can you just talk a little bit, how do you collaborate with Indigenous people in the context of big city? Do you organize meetings? Do you do things in the field? What's the form of engagement?
One of the strengths that we have to build on, which in rushing through my slides and getting through there I might not have articulated very well, is we're building on strength that our steering committee collaborators and partners have already established. So I think really going to those strengths, each of our, whether it's the National Park Service, as a private landowner that I work for, as a government agency, there are certain communities that we've worked with before, and it's really finding those advocates in those communities, finding those success stories to build upon, and then having a meaningful relationship at the table, to actually have the Office of Hawaiian Affairs as a member of the steering committee, to actually have my employer where I work, the Kamehameha School's largest private landowner, as a member of the steering committee, to really help to shape and guide that. And finding out how do you deal with that in light of FACA rules and regulations and who gets to actually vote on things, but being able to still have people in a meaningful role and a seat at the table and in positions of leadership as well.
One more question.
One more.
How are you integrating the concept of landscape or ecosystem management?
All the time. In everything that we do, when we come back to that diagram of the person sitting there, we rolled out, we recognize that the ahupua'a is just one part of the resource management structure. So you do have to understand the geography, you do have to understand how each one of these pie-shaped land divisions that has certain types of natural resources in it, what makes it unique. Because we also know that for climate change impacts, it is going to be very local. What we're going to see, there's going to be global things, but what's really going to matter to people is going to be local. Each ahupua'a is going to be different. And so the people that live there that know that ahupua'a need to be engaged, and then we need to know how to respond to that in those areas, because it is going to be very local. There are going to be very local impacts.
Thank you very much. Okay, we're going to move to Kyle. Kyle, you're all set?
I'm all set.
All right, thank you.
Thanks for your presentation. I really enjoyed that. Bonjour, hello. How is everyone doing? I know that time is short, so I'm going to present as efficiently as I can. I want to share with you all the project that we're doing. The project title is Menajuen, and it's respecting tribes, First Nations, and cultural resources in cooperative landscape and climate change decision-making. Menajuen is a term that means respect, and it's a complicated sense of respect that we have in Great Lakes tribes, and I'll talk about some of those connections later, but it refers to multiple senses of responsibility that Great Lakes tribal people, Anishinaabe people, have toward the land that they depend on. The first thing I wanted to mention is that our LCC project, all of the project investigators are members of Anishinaabe groups. So we're all tribal members of the group that predominates in one part of the Great Lakes. And for this reason, we take our work very, very seriously as work we're doing to protect the land that all of our families have staken and depend on. My presentation is very complementary to the presentation that you just saw. We focus a lot on the political aspects of how science and traditional knowledge are blended together in cooperative resource management and climate change response. So I'm primarily going to talk about issues that have to do with governance. So the first thing I wanted to start with is, why is cooperation, regional cooperation, important to Indigenous nations, so to tribes in the United States and First Nations in Canada? And there's a couple of reasons that I want to share with you all. This is kind of a funny map. This is what it shows. All of these red splotches, these are reservations of Anishinaabe people. The Anishinaabe originated actually in this region. However, through forced migration, through other things that weren't so good, people have been dispersed all over the place. So the southernmost group, which is actually the tribe that I'm enrolled in, is the Citizen Potawatomi Nation of Oklahoma. People up here are shocked that there's an Anishinaabe group in Oklahoma. There's a Prairie Band Potawatomi of Kansas, and people are further north as well. So if you're Anishinaabe, this is the nation. But the United States looks at each one of these red splotches as politically distinct. So in that sense, when I think of my responsibilities to the environment, I'm thinking of this entire area, even an area that wasn't traditionally part of the Anishinaabe world. But that what I think of as the Anishinaabe nation is not necessarily what the United States or Canada thinks of as the Anishinaabe nation. For these nation states, there is no Anishinaabe nation. There's a Citizen Band Potawatomi nation. There's a Sault Ste. Marie Band of Chippewa Indians. There's a, and on and on and on. So the first reason why tribes are interested in cooperating is because tribal people see the land that's significant to them as extending way beyond the reservation. And this is just one sense of that reason. Another sense has to do with treaties. So these red parts, those are actual reservations, but these larger spaces, these are the treaty boundaries. So when most tribes sign treaties, they reserved this smaller area for their exclusive use. However, they recognized that they were dependent on a larger environment, so they made sure that the treaty basically earmarked for them hunting and fishing and other cultural rights in these larger areas. So when tribes think of treaties, they don't think of just a reservation area. They think of these larger treaty areas that members see as integral to the environments that are within the reservation bounds. So this is another reason why cooperation is important, because areas that outsiders don't see as tribal lands really are tribal lands. And this extends obviously with something like fishing to waterways as well. So if a treaty, for example, reserved fishing rights for a particular tribal group, that suggests that certain areas of water that aren't actually considered tribal lands are significant for tribes. Now, one of the issues, if I had more time that I would go into more detail, is there's a further issue which I think was discussed maybe yesterday, which is that it's not just that Tribal lands also, extend beyond the reservation, but there's also an internal component to that. So over the history of the colonization of North America and the establishment of U.S. and Canadian dominance, the actual reservation area, so the area that's exclusively for tribes, has become populated with non-tribal members. Non-tribal members own property in the reservation area. In fact, in a lot of tribes, like where I'm from, non-tribal members outnumber tribal members within the reservational jurisdiction. And this means you have a lot of people in reservations who don't accept the authority of tribal governments. They expect the authority of state government. And so you get also the situation where tribes are interested in cooperation because they realize that inside their own jurisdictions you have different political authorities that are at work, and that everybody needs to be involved in conservation and climate change response. A second reason, which I'm sure a lot of people here are very familiar with, is tribal lands are near public lands and lands that are managed by by the federal government. So and I know you've seen this map before. I mean, this is just Wisconsin. And once again, the red land is reservation, and the other colors are public lands, and you see a lot of proximity. Of course, nationally, this is even more prominent. This is even more the case. And the third reason, finally, and I'll say some things about this, but I'm not going to go into any particular slides, is that tribal members have compatible aspirations about landscape scale conservation and climate change response. And I mean compatible very carefully. Compatible does not mean the same. It doesn't mean obviously related. It doesn't mean that they can immediately come together. What compatible means is there's definitely ways of thinking about the environment in Indian country that foreseeably could work together with other forms of environmentalism. But compatibility should emphasize the work that needs to be done. So it's not just about, if you're a non-native person, learning what native people think, but it's about learning how to listen, learning how to be a good collaborator, learning how to be emotionally responsive and evocative in ways that facilitate good communication and that build trust. And some of these issues were covered in the previous presentation, and a lot of Native people are going to emphasize that. What a lot of Native people see is that there is a possibility for cooperation, there is a possibility for collaboration, but we have to do the work. So insofar as it's more than just Native people that care about regional, environmental, and natural resource issues, that's an opportunity to build cooperation. The purpose of our project is this basic question. What makes cooperation work? And this is from a political standpoint, from a managerial standpoint. And our sort of key question is, what factors and principles lead to success or failure in tribal First Nations cooperative environmental management of regional issues that concern the LCC program? And one of the reasons why this question is particularly important is because when most people think about tribal First Nations cooperation, they think about projects that were started by the US, by Canada, by provincial government, even in some cases by state governments that have attempted to fit tribes within their plans. And there's a lot of positive features of these sorts of programs, but it's not the only game in town. So for example, in the Great Lakes region, we could list off all of the different programs that were initiated by Health Canada or by EPA or even the state of Michigan that actively involve tribes in regional cooperation. But how many of us can actually list off the same sorts of kinds of cooperations, but that are exclusively of tribal members and that involve tribal governments self-initiating those cooperations, or even tribal non-governmental organizations or tribal community activists that have linked up with other tribal members in the Great Lakes region to engage in regional conservation planning and climate change response. And we have roughly 50 examples of that just in the Great Lakes. And this includes the Anishinaabe part of the Great Lakes, so more of the western end, as well as the Haudenosaunee, which New York, Quebec, parts of Ontario. And we want to actually find out, well, what makes these cooperations work? Both the stuff that's initiated by the U.S. Or that's initiated by EPA, non-tribal groups, but also the cooperations that have been initiated by tribal members themselves, and which they're doing out of their concern for the environment. So we're looking at cooperative responses then to regional environmental natural resource issues involving tribes and First Nations. So here's what we mean by cooperative. So they involve more than one group, and it could include any of those, tribe, First Nation, NGO. It has to be regional, so the project extends beyond the boundaries of a single reservation, homeland, or jurisdictional boundary. And what we want to do is then compare examples where tribes and First Nations were actually involved setting up the project with those that were set up by someone else and that involve tribes and First Nations. And we want to look at whether there are certain principles or factors that makes one kind successful, the other kind successful, or failure, and if maybe one is better than the other, or if there's some way of actually comparing or contrasting them. And this is how we're going about doing it. So we have identified a bunch of these groups, and we're continuing to engage in identifying these different cooperatives. We developed 9 questions, and we're actually interviewing each of these groups to find out what they think about what I just presented. And the way in which we came up with the list of groups, sort of the sampling framework that we used, is because all of us are enrolled in tribes in this area and have been networked into this region for some time. We came up with those groups that we thought were important, and then from there we sort of snowballed it. So then those people told us about groups that we'd never heard of, but that they knew that were doing powerful work. And from there we've sort of compiled this list. We've also engaged in the typical sort of documentary research, looking at gray literature, peer-reviewed articles, as well as anything we can find to sort of build a portrait of these different organizations. And then we followed up with each group after we've done this sort of basic research and talked to them on the phone. We've gone over the questions again, we've engaged in further dialogue, and this is what we're doing fairly actively right now, is these phone interviews. And then from there we're actually going to do a kind of a data analysis where we extract themes and actually see whether we can identify factors and principles that led to success or failure in these different kinds of cooperatives. And we're going to wrap everything up then with focus groups where we're going to selectively choose different conferences where tribes and First Nations are getting together, where members of different cooperatives are talking to each other, and we're going to actually see what they have to say about what we came up with in these phases. And we're going to kind of get what their logic is and what their insights are about what we've came up with, and for them also to give us some more of the context that we were unable to get through the interviews and through the other research that we did. So I want to just conclude by, now you've sort of heard some of these basics, so I want to just conclude by talking about, overall what's at stake. If you look at most of the literature or what people know about regional governance, so by governance I mean something very specific. I mean a form of democratic, collaborative coordination that doesn't just rely on state or federal authority, but that involves NGOs, private citizens groups, and other people coming together to really coordinate their behaviors in meaningful ways in terms of conservation. When a lot of people think of governance, they think of creative strategies that the U.S. and Canada has tried to engage in order to bring tribes in. We want to tell a different story. We want to talk about what tribes have done according to their own volition, what they've done oftentimes on a shoestring budget. And we want to see whether there are principles and factors that we can pull out of that, which then we can share with other people and say, look, this is a model of governance. It's something that can be done in addition to formal tribal consultation. It's something that can be done in addition to, in the United States, what we call tribal treatment as state status, which is one of the policies since the late 1970s in the United States, is to give tribes the same powers that states have over environmental management. We want to pose this also as an alternative to the kinds of joint and co-management that you see in Canada and also sometimes in the United States. So our goal then is to come up with these factors and principles by talking to to the folks that are applying them and have the experience. And this would then be a basis for building not only the intertribal, inter-First Nations network in the Great Lakes and protecting the Anishinaabe Nation as a whole, but also for advancing the network, the LCC network, and for finding ways to represent these groups and to integrate science and traditional knowledge together toward cooperative conservation and climate change response.
Thank you, Kyle. Any questions?
I came in after the session had started, so forgive me if you've already gone over this earlier. What constitutes an action that would call for government-to-government consultation? And is that consistent, or is it something that's unique to each tribe?
So do you mean, okay, that's a really complicated question because, but
I'm looking for a complicated answer.
and I can give you one. So because it's funny because what you just said, I want to make sure that it makes sense in terms of what I just said, saying we're trying to find a different, or another model that could be used, right? So in the classic sense, when would government-to-government negotiation or collaboration occur? Well, it was usually when you get a case where, say, a private citizen living on a reservation would engage in an activity that the tribe didn't like. The tribe wanted to use its jurisdiction and authority then to bring those actions to justice, and you'd have a court case where it would be worked out exactly how it is that the tribe is supposed to relate to the federal government or the state government or whoever the political authorities are. So the first thing is that you get a lot of these adversarial cases that are going on, right? But those are limited to cases where you actually have a dispute. The second area where you see government-to-government relation is what's called the sort of EPA's Indian policy. And Canada has its analog to this, but for purpose of time, we'll just talk about the U.S. version. And the U.S. really tried to integrate tribes within what you all know as cooperative federalism, which is that states should manage their own environmental programs. And the idea was that tribes should also manage their own environmental programs if they qualify bureaucratically to do so. So clean air, clean water, and so on. So there then you have government-to-government interaction in the proceedings where it's determined that a tribe can properly take over the functions of states, right? So the sphere of government-to-government then refers to these very sort of formal situations, either disputes or where tribes have been named in environmental policies or other statutes. What we're suggesting is that there's an entirely different sphere where it's not just activities that are initiated by state, provincial, or federal governments, but you either have tribal governments initiating projects on their own by themselves among other tribal governments so that they see a regional issue that extends beyond their particular reservations or reserves, and they choose to come together to try to deal with that. So the Michigan Tribal Environmental Group is an example of this. Then you also, so that's not government to government in the sense of tribal government and U.S. government, for example, or state of Michigan. Then you have other cases where it's not really the tribal government that are the primary movers. You're going to have concerned tribal citizens that see a regional issue and they say, well, wait a minute, well, we're Ojibways in this area, and we want to link up with the Potawatomis in this area, and we're actually going to form a conservation movement, and then we're going to apply for funding, and we're going to want to work with scientists, and we're going to want to bring in elders and other traditional knowledge holders. So that's a case where you don't really have a government to government, right? But that you have tribal members who are acting on the idea that they are the sovereign stewards of the land. So in that sense, right, they're going back to this historical sense that tribes never gave up the land. Tribes never consented to U.S. or state rule. So that's the way I want to answer your question, is you have numerous different examples. Some we want to call government to government, and some we don't necessarily want to call government to government, but are very important and should be connected to government relations. Does that help a little bit?
Yes, thank you.
Some follow-up to that point?
Yeah, I think Chair put out some of the Native American program manager for the Institute for Environmental Resolution. So like, there's more, I think, practical application of what government will play. For example, through development of programming policies or regulation changes that have been contemplated, I might touch upon the tribe's treaty rights. Right? So when you're talking about tree rights, you're talking about water, land, cultural, animal, natural resources, right? Not only within the exterior boundary of the reservation, but there's also provisions in the water treaties that say unusual and custom places. And in those particular situations, you have resources that can be impacted hundreds of miles away from what you think is the geographical region of the tribe, right? And so, a good example would be most recently the Eagle Feather case, right? You see the application of federal regulatory regulations, the taking of eagles, and you see a conflict from the tribal perspective, really kind of thinking about the absurdity of applying to the federal government for religious practice, like the use of eagle feathers. So in those kind of situations, you can see that government will arise, like those relationships. But it also is determined too by, I think, how an agency determines its fiduciary responsibilities to the tribe themselves. And usually, those responsibilities will be further determined in government meetings, face-to-face meetings, informal meetings, to talk about what the tribe feels is important, what their interests might be, identifying what activities an agency, the state, tribal, or even non-governmental stakeholders might undertake that can impact those tribal interests. Right? So we're talking about any cultural, significant sacred sites, burial sites, water, plants, the list can become pretty extensive. But as a rule of thumb, the best thing to do is probably, one is determine what the relationship that your federal agency has been up to that point with specific tribes. That way you're not duplicating efforts and you understand where you're going in this relationship building. The second part is perhaps sitting down with the tribal resources director, tribal leadership, council, and really requesting, I think, a sense of identification of those resources that may be impacted by those activities by the federal agency. Right? So those are some of the things that can arise in these kind of conversations. But yeah, it's pretty complex. But rule of thumb is to work with tribes and identify what those specific items might be. Right?
Thanks, that's good.
I'll also just say one thing to add on to that. Yeah, so within that sphere too, and I can also forward you some examples by email. There have been actually, so take the area of risk assessment, for example. There are examples where through government to government relations, like this gentleman was talking about, there have been sort of cooperative models for risk assessment that are inclusive of tribal narratives and that have the same formality as the EPA understanding of risk, and that are then enforceable, right, by EPA.
Will you stand, please?
Also, can you introduce yourself?
Marie Schuster with the United States Geological Survey. So I'm wondering on the back side of this, you're talking about doing the data gathering, information gathering, contacting folks, and I assume that's to look at the resilience building projects being implemented by tribes and all that. And one of the things we often find in rural communities, especially when you're talking about what are you doing about climate change, or do you want to adapt to climate change? Most people don't necessarily respond to that right away because climate change is that sort of ghosting machine. That's not really, it's not a disaster. It's something that might happen sometime in the future to somebody, and maybe me or somebody else. So I'm wondering if you have examples of what those resilience building projects may be. If you're sort of anticipating what kind of information you can get.
Yeah, so that's a good question insofar as we're still sort of going through a lot of the interviews. So in a very general sense, what I'm expecting that we'll find, and maybe to give you a little bit of background. So the idea of adapting to something like climate change is not new to a lot of tribal communities. I mean, especially in the Anishinaabe world, most groups at some point had to migrate. Not everyone as far as Oklahoma. But this idea of adaptation and climate has been something that people in the Great Lakes have been discussing in all sorts of different contexts. So because of that, there are numerous conferences that occur just held by tribal groups within the Great Lakes that I've attended. Now, what I would say I expect that we're going to find out, and I sort of mentioned very briefly something like this in the presentation, is that we're going to find very creative approaches where people found ways to, on a shoestring budget, and in a political climate that's very difficult, that they found ways to express their values and aspirations regarding the environment, and that there's going to be something about resilience that involves the blending together of very practical thinking with very traditional thinking, and with creative ways of reaching out to non-tribal communities as well. So that's as good as I can give you for now, but I look forward, like, in a year to maybe share more. Yeah.
I was just going to add that as a rule of thumb, and the analogy here is that I'm watching TV, I'm watching CNN, right? And they give you all of these different polls out there, and usually the polls will be based upon some sort of statistical sampling based upon ethnicity. So many African Americans feel this way, so many Asian Americans feel this way, so many Hispanic Americans feel this way, right? In the back of my mind, as I'm watching TV, I'm thinking to myself, what about the Native Americans, right? If you watch news, watch TV, you oftentimes see the exclusion of that population in all kinds of studies, right? And so when we talk about the landscape cooperatives, we talk about the CSCs and things like that, oftentimes, I'll sit back there and I'll listen to great information, but then I'll think to myself, well, what about the tribes, right? And so I think that as you go through your planning processes and your meetings in places like this, always remember to ask yourself, what about the tribes, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's what about tribes, and also the assumption that the tribes are probably doing something. They're probably active on that issue.
Really great resources.
Yeah.
So, we're going to take one last question. We want to be respectful of everybody's time going to the break and the next session. I'm hoping that Lulia and Kyle will stay for a few more minutes if there's additional questions. If folks want to say hello. But one last question.
Bridget Costanzo with the Appalachian LCC. And my question is about coordination with tribes and looking for opportunities to collaborate. And because so many of the LCCs are so large, there might be multiple, sometimes hundreds of tribes that have an interest in that geography. And we're getting feedback already from state agencies and from some of the partnerships that we're overextending their ability to respond to our good intentions to look for collaboration opportunities. So I'm wondering if you have, any of you have advice on how we might best approach that.
I don't have advice other than to say that that's the exact dynamic that, in our region we're trying to address with this project.
I have a suggestion. We can take it as advice. Begin to think about how to organize, right, among other LCCs or among your colleagues within the region on how communication can be sent out to the tribes. Since 2009, President Obama signed the executive memorandum on tribal consultation directing the agencies to develop tribal action plans that ultimately lead to tribal consultation plans. Well, what's happening is that across the federal spectrum, all these agencies develop these plans are all sending these letters out to the Indian country, right? And so there's an interesting term that's coming up right now called consultation fatigue, which I think the kids are drinking from the fire hose, right? And so I'm thinking that, well, one thing that we're primarily concerned about, we're being myself, my colleagues, Lucy Moore, and the U.S. Institute, and our work with the LCCs in the role as sort of an entity that assists in process design and also facilitations at times, is how are you going to develop the organized conversation among all of the different LCCs and the CSCs over here where there's overlap, so that, one, there are not multiple communications going out to tribes, and two, the tribes understand who is communicating to them and why it's important that they should participate or send information back about the participation, right? And that those communications identify those natural resource managers, environmental directors, the people that really are in the community doing the work. That we always said it to the tribal president, and Lord bless us, this is a great word, but most likely it's going to get stuck right there in the president's office or the council's office, right? Yeah, so there's different techniques to use to get communications out there to be, but how you do that is going to be, I think, effective in coordinating and organizing that first, right? And so that's my plug for myself and Lucy here, that, we're here to get your cards, your information, and things like that, because we're starting to do an assessment on what is out there, what is happening, and who's working with them, and how can we best utilize quasi-tribal governmental organizations like the National Congress of American Indians. They're not non-governmental, right? Because because they have tribal leadership as members of these organizations, quasi-government. But the thing is that we'd like to get our hands around this thing, figure out, well, how can we best communicate and really organize this effort so that tribal information is a part of all of this science conversation on climate change and climate. So that's it.
I have one quick follow-up on that, and I apologize if what I'm going to say just is an affront to anybody in the room, but I think part of our participation brings a completely different perspective to the conversation that's happening. We don't have in Hawaii some of the same relationship challenges that I frequently hear at conferences that I go to, and we focus on this government-to-government relationship that I think sometimes prevents us from establishing or understanding what a really respectful person-to-person or people-to-people relationship would be. And I might be stating quite the obvious here when I say that, yes, even though we don't have some of those challenges in Hawaii, consultation fatigue for other reasons is prevalent and was one of the findings of that NPS, early findings of that NPS study that's going on right now. And what are some of the things that as just regular people, if you think beyond some of our, what does my box say that I need to do and check, is also to recognize that something that you guys already know, lack of response does not mean acceptance, or it does not mean that I don't want to engage, it's just not a good time. And that frequently the indigenous communities don't mind, yeah, you're going to come back again, and you're going to come back again, and at some point I might be able to come to that table and to be there, but now is not a good time. But it doesn't mean it's not important to me, it doesn't mean it's not of interest, it doesn't mean that I don't want to hear what's being said. It's also definitely the communication, but some of those simple relationship matters, I think, we both can use that, and we know that this relationship has been bad, and there's no trust there. So if we rely on that relationship that has no trust, it'll be hard for us as people to have trust. So sometimes we just have to just think about that a little bit. And I apologize if that's an affront to folks that have that relationship, but that's just the perspective we can bring.
And let's thank our presenters for sharing.